This morning, we're moving into Matthew chapter 2. We've already covered chapter 1, and we're going to be looking at chapter 2, which I'm calling Jesus' infancy narrative. And as we look at that, let's see. Okay. We move from the genealogical record of Jesus and his birth to the infancy narrative of Jesus. And it's in this brief time period that some significant things begin to happen that push the narrative theme along. And that narrative theme in Matthew is one that is very clear. The longer or the more that you read through the book of Matthew, you can really see it. Jesus is King and Messiah. But he is not the King and not the Messiah that the Jews expected. Something completely different. And so in chapter 2, as we begin looking at Matthew's account of Jesus' early years, Matthew has a unique take on that. And there's some things that we'll be looking at to see why Matthew brings those up. But in this narrative of chapter 2, we have the visit of the wise men, and that's verses 1 through 12, and we will cover that section this morning. Then there's the flight to Egypt, verses 13 through 15. Herod kills the children, verses 16 through 18, and then at the end, the return to Nazareth. So this is the sort of the fourfold movement in chapter 2 that we'll be looking at regarding Jesus. Now, as we look at the visit of the wise men, the date of the visit is established. Turn to Matthew chapter 2. Up until this point in time, especially as we've looked all the things that we looked at and came down through chapter 1, there's not been any time markers. But all of a sudden in chapter 2, we find out when this date of the Magi occurs. So after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod. And as you may know a little bit about the history of King Herod, he was not so nice. He was called Herod the Great because he did a lot of things as far as the city of Jerusalem is concerned. There was the rebuilding that he started on the temple. There were other community civil projects, many of them quite spectacular, but also very costly. And during the time of his reign, a lot of the citizens felt really oppressed tax-wise. So they really didn't appreciate him very well. And he sort of had the reputation of being pretty cruel. And when we get later on in chapter 2, sure enough, what we find out going on kind of matches his reputation, and you're not surprised that he took the direction that he did. But who are these people that come for the visit? They are the Magi. That's a transliteration, almost, of the Greek, the magoi. Who are the Magi? Well, they've heard that this King of the Jews was born. They came from the east to Jerusalem, and they asked. Now, coming from the east, being the wise men, there has been a lot of speculation on, well, who are these guys? Well, tradition, interestingly, tries to, and I was thinking about this earlier this morning. The reason we have a lot of traditions that we do in the history of Christianity, going back to the time of Jesus, is because a lot of people hate vacuum and lack of information. And because of that, there's a tendency to supply information that's not there. Because we know that old saying, inquiring minds want to know. Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of things in life we'll never get to know. We just don't have the information. Now, that doesn't mean that traditions are bad, but you have to understand sometimes that some traditions are based on things that people sort of made up to fill up an emptiness that they didn't like was there. We don't know who these wise men were. I'm told that when, this is interesting, when Patty Boyd teaches this to the young ones back in the back, instead of talking about the 3 wise men, she talks about the 4 wise men, and that there were 3 gifts. You need to talk to Patty about it. And I think it's her way of trying to teach even the little ones. We don't know how many there were. Now, it's interesting, traditionally, we think that there were 3 wise men based on what? What's the connection that people make to say that there were 3 wise men? Yeah, there were 3 gifts. And so you just assume, well, one gift was born by someone, a wise man, and then another one, and so on. Now, because they come from the east, or most likely Persia, there's also been the tradition that and you've heard of this, instead of the 3 wise men, we 3 kings of Orient are. So some people have even assumed that they were kings instead of just wise men. And we could go on and on about all of the traditions that surround this. What I'm amazed at, in Matthew's telling of these stories in chapter 2, they are very simple, but they're also very powerful. I think it was Philip Yancey in talking about the Gospels. One of the things that he pointed out I thought was amazing is that the Gospels, in telling the story of Jesus, are really good at what's called the economy of words. And think about that. How few words are used by each gospel writer to talk about a particular event. Good writers that I'm aware of usually like to have tons of information about stuff. The more they give you, the more information you've got, the more you want to know, and so they supply that information. The gospel writers have an approach that's called economy of words. They get the story told in almost the least amount of language that's needed. It's kind of interesting. And they certainly don't appeal to or seek to answer all the questions that we have, because we always have a lot of questions that they're not interested in answering. So, where did they come from? They came from the east. Notice the purpose of their visit. The purpose of their visit says, we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. So, early in the Gospel of Matthew, this idea of worship surfaces. And I want us to look at it a minute because the concept is very important. It's the key question in Matthew. What does it mean to worship the Messiah? The word that is used is, let me see if I've got the definition here. It's to kiss the hand toward. It's a token of reverence. It's also the idea of, especially from the Middle East, this is how they would practice it, to fall upon the ground on your knees, touch the ground with the forehead, and it's a prostrate expression of bowing down towards someone who is a person of honor or privilege or some kind of authority. And so it was a cultural practice that goes many centuries back. In the New Testament, is by kneeling or prostration to do homage or to make obeisance, whether in order to express respect or to make supplication. And it's used of homage shown to men and beings of superior rank. For example, to the Jewish high priest, to God, to Christ, to the heavenly beings, to the demons even. Worship toward demons is mentioned. So here's the thing that's really striking to me, that when it's used, particularly toward Jesus, it is someone proskuneo, prostrating themselves, giving homage, kneeling down, however you want to express it bodily. But the idea is Jesus is there when it's being done. So that for those of us who live 2,000 years later, we have to conceive of doing something for Jesus with his not being here in person. Because the way this is used originally is it's the idea in the presence of someone else. So we have to start thinking about our idea of worship because Jesus is not here in person. I don't like the word worship because it unnecessarily restricts the meaning and even the place of this action. If I use the word worship, what do you sort of typically think of? What do you think of when you hear the word worship? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? What's that? The assembly on Sunday morning. And what else might come to your mind? Certain activities that you engage in, but most of them are kind of restricted to Sunday morning, aren't they? The word worship was never intended to be restricted to a place and a time like that. And what it does, when you look how Matthew uses it, you will find he doesn't restrict it to an assembly on Sunday morning like we think of. And it makes us think in broader terms. And again, answering the question, let's see if I can go back to it. A great question. The key question, what does it mean to worship the Messiah? That's the key question. And as we go through the Gospel of Matthew, we're going to be looking at what does that really entail? What does that mean for me today? If I'm trying to follow Jesus as King and Messiah in my life, what does that need to look like? So we'll continue and pursue that and hopefully seek to answer it as we go through. Now, notice, and let's see. I want to do this. We probably need to look at this right now. In addition to chapter 2 and verse 2, look down at verse 11. It says, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, and this is the wise men, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. So notice it's a response to what they discovered and found. So that there's an element of worship, and it's very foundational to its concept. It's a response. So let's think about this. Now, everything that we're going to say about worship doesn't negate Sunday morning. I don't want you to get the idea I'm saying, that cuts out Sunday morning. It doesn't. What we just need to do is expand our understanding of it. But this part of it's really amazing to think about in respect to our Sunday morning assembly. If at its root idea and core concept, worship is response, then that means when we assemble together on Sunday morning as God's people, everything we do together is a united response to what God has done for us in many different dimensions. All the way from His gift of salvation through Christ, how God has answered our prayers the past week, how God has been our caring, loving Father through the past week, how God has provided for us, how God has been near us. I mean, I can just think of a lot of things that provide the foundation for worship being our response to God. Now think about, and I was thinking about this, we don't have time to do this. This would be really cool. Go through our songbook and the songs that we're used to singing and look at how many of them have language that is tied around our responding to what God has done for us. Our songs are filled with that kind of language. And it's very appropriate because that's what worship is. Okay? Now, in chapter 14 of Matthew, Turn over to chapter 14, verse 33. This is a great example again. This is the story and the narrative of Jesus walking on the water. And I want you to look. This is when Peter tried, and he sank, and the Lord reached out his hand, caught him up. "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat and the wind died down, then they were in the boat and worshiped him. It means they sort of bowed down at his feet, prostrate. "Truly you are the Son of God." Wow. I can't imagine a more compelling moment to just fall down before the feet of Jesus and confess, "Truly are you are the Son of God." And that it's watching Peter walk on the water for a little bit, and then he sinks, and the Lord rescues him. Wow, what a compelling moment to express this kind of homage and reverence to Jesus. And it gives us an insight then that this idea of worship, it's never taken lightly in the Gospel of Matthew. It's real crucial in response to God. Look at chapter 28. Chapter 28 of Matthew and verse 9. "So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy. And they ran to tell his disciples. 'Greetings,' he said. And they came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. And Jesus said, 'Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brother to go to Galilee. There they will see me.'" They fell at his feet, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. That's after his resurrection. Again, this event motivates this kind of response. It produces this kind of response. It's the only response available, I think. Can you imagine being in their shoes? Jesus has now come forth from the dead, and they recognize who he is, so they fall down at his feet, grab his feet, and worship him. Okay? And then 28 verse 17. "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted." Now, it's interesting that in all of the Gospels, this is a fascinating concept. And again, I wish we had time to pursue this. If we have time in our studies here in Matthew, I may do this. All four of the Gospels address the issue of doubting who Jesus is. It's not an easy thing for some people to come to faith regarding who Jesus is. It's amazing that even in this context, look at who's here. 11 disciples. They went to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Who were the some that doubted? Not Gentiles, not people that didn't know him. Apparently, some of the 11 doubted. Like, oh, well, we shouldn't be too hard on them. I wonder if we were one of the 11, would we be part of those that really had a hard time? I would say it this way. It may be that the word doubted carries way too much negative connotation. Think of it this way. They had a real hard time putting the pieces together. You ever been in that situation? They had a real hard time trying to put all the pieces together so the picture comes out real nice. They were struggling with this. And again, it's in the context where for some, they were at the point where their response was that they worshiped. There were some who got it, who had an inkling. So this is amazing for some. And again, wouldn't it be neat if we could have had a list here at this point. Okay, here are the 6 who got it, and here are the 5 struggling that didn't. You know, we're not given that name list. We don't know who did and who didn't. But some of them did. They got an inkling as to a little bit of what was going on. And again, their only response was to fall down and worship Jesus. Wow. So this concept of worship in Matthew, and the reason I'm setting you up so much with this, because we're going to come back to the old King Herod in just a moment. The reason this is so important is it makes you aware that a key component of our worship, and let's say it this way, whether it is private or whether it is public, because there are different forms of worship depending on where you are, but just across the board, whether it's private or public, all worship is perceived as a response to the amazing work of God. That's why it saddens me when churches get into all these uproars about styles of worship and it's just unbelievable. I'm like, man, people have missed it. Our worship is a response to the amazing work of God. And because we don't have, think about this, because we don't have very much detail at all in the assemblies of the early churches, I think depending on where they were in the Greco-Roman Empire and the background of many of the early Christians, your different assemblies looked a little different. In fact, that becomes a little bit of point of controversy that we'll talk about when we get further into Matthew. But when Christians understood the amazing work of God, that's what prompted their worship. And that really shouldn't come as a surprise to us when we see Jesus as King and Messiah. He's not concerned about power and who he can control for his own purposes. Jesus is concerned about the reign of God in the human heart, the transformation of the human heart. That's what got him into so much trouble. He kept drawing people back to heart issues. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why is this tradition you're so hung up on important to you when it negates the will of God? Of course, that was astounding when they heard that. That's partly what got him crucified. So these are the ideas that are related to worship. Just from the book of Matthew. It says that King Herod was troubled and all Israel with him. Well, I think the reason all Israel with him is the expression, I think Herod stirred up all Israel. It wasn't just the fact they came alongside and said, oh, guess what, Herod, we're troubled too, like you. No. It looks like Herod was behind all this troubling. So he assembled and inquired of the chief priests and scribes. And they have an interesting answer, because when he asked the question, now, where is this guy? How's this supposed to happen? And their immediate response in Matthew chapter 2 is this. It said, it's what the prophet has written. And let me pause here to make a point. In the Gospel of Matthew, there are 2 ways in which the Old Testament is appealed to. One is, this is done that it might be fulfilled. And we may have one entire lesson where we walk through the Gospel of Matthew and look at the fulfillment themes, because those are critical. But then also there are occasions, and this is one of those, where the chief priests and the scribes, they're going to quote from a prophet. And the assumption is that even they themselves have this fulfillment idea in their brain, even though Matthew doesn't say this was done that it might be fulfilled. But they say, this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now here's the interesting thing, and I don't know, I guess it's large enough. I was concerned if I could get it large enough so you could see the comparison. here's another thing that's interesting about, and again, if we have time, we need to have a whole lesson on how Matthew uses the Old Testament. Because sometimes what Matthew does, and a lot of the other New Testament writers will do this, they will pull together a couple of verses and kind of condense it into one. And if you compare the text in Matthew with the quote from Micah, this is a quote from the prophet Micah. It's chapter 5, basically verses 2 through 4. So in Matthew, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. This is taken from the English Standard Version, the Matthew quote. The NIV doesn't have the last phrase, who will shepherd my people Israel. However, I think the English Standard Version may be going on some Hebrew manuscripts that do contain it. The traditional ones don't. Because what you get from Micah is, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans or the rulers of Judah, out of you will come from me one who will be ruler over Israel. And when you go to Micah, you don't find the idea of shepherd in verse 2. You have to jump down to verse 4. And what it looks like is that Matthew, when the chief priests and scribes were quoting this text, there was a common way that they appropriated this text for their expectation of the coming Messiah. And the thing that's fascinating, if you have Micah, jump over real quick, because I want you to see how this particular text starts off. Chapter 5, verse 1. And when I read these words, you're going to see how military they sound. And Israel and Judah, even from this context of the prophet Micah, would have understood this with this strong military sort of umbrella in which the words are given. And that's why for these chief priests and scribes, when Herod asked, okay, where is he? Where's he coming from? What do we need to know about this? They immediately jump to this text. Micah 5, verse 1. Marshal your troops now, city of troops. For a siege is laid against us. They will strike Israel's ruler on the cheek with a rod. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah. And notice down in verse 3 of Micah, therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. So in Micah, this looks like a call to troops because Israel has had a pretty bad time with an enemy. And the Jews of Jesus' day, this is a perfect text out of the Old Testament, they would have known all of these verses that would have sort of whipped up the military fervor. And so just be aware of that, because when they quote from Micah chapter 5, there is the understanding that they knew what this was to be used for. And I put that here. The text in Micah 5 begins with a call to arms. Herod summons the wise men, and he says, go and diligently search for him, because I also want to worship him. Really? This is an amazing thing already in the book of Matthew. We have two kingdoms coming to clash. The kingdom of God with Jesus being Son of God and Messiah. The kingdom of Herod, who represents all of the kingly earthly power that is at odds with the kingdom of God. It's set up very early here in the book of Matthew. Because if I were to ask this, do you think that Herod really, really wanted to worship Jesus? He had other designs in mind, didn't he? He had some tricks up his sleeve. Of course, he didn't tell the wise men, well, I want you to go look for him. You look for him diligently. When you find him, you come back and tell me because I want to worship him. This gives us another insight into something in the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to be confronted with, what is false worship all about? What is false worship all about? Well, remember our big broad definition of this word worship in Matthew. If it is indeed this overwhelming response to the work of God, think of just flipping the coin over the opposite. We know immediately what false worship is. You're not even thinking about the great work of God. It's just something on the outside that looks like you're doing worship when inside you've got something else in mind. Now, in the book of Matthew, this is called hypocrites. And when we get a little bit later in Jesus' ministry, he's going to come face to face with these people called hypocrites. When on the outside, they've tried to get everything in order, make it look good, boy, on the inside, they've got other intentions. And this is brought to the forefront already in Matthew 2 by this figure called Herod. He makes people think that he wants to worship Jesus. He's got other designs in mind. So just be aware of that's the beginning to understand what false worship is. And here's what we've tried to make it through the years. We think of false worship if I do something wrong in church. And that's not what Matthew's talking about. That would be the response, wouldn't it? That part, and we talked about that earlier, and that's a great thing to add to the list. Yep. Yes. Oh, the Great Commission. Isn't it interesting? When we get to the end of the book of Matthew, we're going to talk about that Great Commission. And I have a good story to tell about it. When I get there, I'll save the story for that. But isn't it interesting that for Matthew, false worship is not necessarily doing the wrong thing, because that's tend to what we think. It's doing the things that look okay, but inside, your intent is different. And the strong message that Matthew's trying to get across, even at this early age, or early state of the Gospel of Matthew, Herod is case study number one. You think you're fooling other people? You're not fooling God. The kingdom of God is what's at play here, not the kingdom of Herod. The plan of God is what's unfolding here, not the plan of King Herod. It's so funny how Herod's plans eventually just collapse in on him. For a while, he thinks he's got the upper hand and he's the one in control. He has to learn the hard way. No, he's not in control. This is God's kingdom, not Herod's. Well, we'll begin there next week, and appreciate you all being here this morning.